Okay, so in this video, I want to focus on one. I want to focus on what Karen Armstrong says about Jesus becoming God. So I have a history of God right here by Karen Armstrong, and Karen Armstrong is a world-renowned historian on religion, and what she says actually is pretty interesting. She says we know very little about Jesus. I don't agree 100% on that, but it does make a little sense given the unknown authorship of the Gospels and the fact that we don't have the sources of the Gospel. So it does make sense. But anyways, I don't fully agree with that statement. But anyways, the first full length, she says, the first full length account of his life was Saint Mark's Gospel, which was not written until the year 70, some 40 years after his death. By that time, historical facts had been overlaid with mythical elements which expressed the meaning Jesus had acquired for his followers. In meaning that Saint Mark primarily conveys rather a reliable, straightforward portrayal. The first Christians saw him, Jesus, as a new Moses, new Joshua, the founder of a new Israel. Then she says that during his lifetime, many Jews in Palestine had believed he was the Messiah and had ridden into Jerusalem and had been hailed the son of David. Uh, then she says, well, she says a lot of things that do align with the what the Quran says about Jesus. She says, for example, on page 80 of this book, his followers worshiped in the temple every day as full observant Jews. Ultimately, however, the new Israel, inspired by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, would become a Gentile faith, which would evolve in its distinctive concept of God. So she says that Jesus' followers worshiped in the temple every day as observant Jews. What is the Jewish temple? The Jewish temple is the place where the Jews would worship their God, and she says they worshipped in the temple every day as observant Jews. So Jesus' disciples worshipped in the temple, the Jewish temple, every day. They worshiped one God, and they were observant Jews. That means they believed in only one God and that Jesus is not God. She says Jews expected the Messiah, the Anointed One, to be the descendant of King David, who, as king and spiritual leader, had founded the first independent Jewish kingdom in Israel. She later on says that nobody expected the Messiah to be a divine figure. He would simply be an ordinary, if privileged, human being. So, the people claiming that Jesus was the Messiah in the Gospel of Mark, like she says here, where is it? Where is it? Yeah, during his lifetime, many Jews in Palestine had believed Jesus was the Messiah and had it ridden into Jerusalem. So, according to the Gospel of Mark, many people around Jesus thought Jesus was the Messiah and not the Son of God, or not any kind of divine figure. She writes, Mark's Gospel, which is the earliest, is usually regarded as the most reliable. It presents Jesus as a perfectly normal man with a family that included brothers and sisters. No angels announced his birth or sang over his crib. So she says that the Gospel of Mark presents Jesus as a perfectly normal man. That means Jesus is not God or the Son of God or the literal divine Son of God. Jesus is seen as a normal man, and Jesus himself identifies himself as a prophet. In Mark chapter 6, verse 4, Jesus identifies himself as a prophet. She later on says that, what else did she say? She says that after his death, on page 81, she says after his death, his followers decided that Jesus had been divine. This did not happen immediately, as we shall see. The doctrine that Jesus had been God in human form was not finalized until the 4th century. The development of the Christian belief in the incarnation was a gradual, complex process. Jesus himself certainly never claimed to be God. At his baptism, he had been called the Son of God by the voice from heaven, but this was probably a simply confirmation that he was the beloved Messiah. So notice what she writes here. She says, Jesus' followers decided that he had been divine. Jesus wasn't always divine. They decided, or they made up the concept that he was divine. Um, she even says that the doctrine that Jesus had been God in human form was not finalized until the 4th century. So, 400 years after Jesus died, the concept that Jesus had been God in human form came 400 years after Jesus. The development of the Christian belief in the incarnation was a gradual, complex process. So it was not an immediate process. It took a long time for Jesus to become God. She even writes, Jesus himself certainly never claimed to be God, and that's true, because if you read the New Testament, nowhere does Jesus say, I am God, or worship me. And according to the Old Testament, God says, I am God, and worship me. So if Jesus is the God of the Old Testament, why doesn't Jesus repeat the same words that God uses in the Old Testament? It doesn't make any sense. So this is just some of my observations in reading this book, A History of God, the 4,000-year quest of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam by Karen Armstrong. She brings up a lot of interesting points about how Jesus became God, and et cetera, et cetera. So I would definitely recommend reading. I'm going to be given more insight from this book about the name Yahweh, but this is just one of some of the many interesting points she brings up, which the history of Christianity seems to align with the Islamic view that Jesus himself never claimed to be God, that Jesus was a normal human according to the earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, and that concept that Jesus became God was a gradual process that came in the 4th century. It was an evolved process. But even if you read the Gospel of Mark carefully, Jesus identifies himself as a prophet, and the people around him don't identify him as any kind of divine or literal son of God or God himself. So the Gospel of Mark, Jesus again identifies himself as a prophet in Mark chapter 6, verse 4. And if you read the Gospel of Mark, the young man asks Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And he says, Hear, O Israel, worship only one God. So Jesus himself says, worship one God. He doesn't tell that person that I am God, worship me. No, he says, the greatest commandment is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. So Jesus is affirming the Old Testament creed of worshiping one God, or thou shalt not have any gods before God. So Jesus is affirming unity of God in the worship of the one God, as he says in the Gospel of Mark. So this is just some of the many insights from this book that I got. Stay tuned. More videos coming up ahead discussing some interesting points in this book, A History of God.